Thank you. And now Wes is going to share.
Okay. Before I get on to the sharing part, um, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes in prayer for all those concerns that were brought forward. Um, in Ghana, what would happen often in prayer time is that everybody would just start praying out loud. And then the person at the front would sort of direct prayer, but it was this huge noise from however many people shouting to God or praying quietly to God or however they felt. Um, and it feels this morning, listening to all of your concerns, that that's sort of the way it feels, is that we need to just take all of this and shout to God and say, God, it's just so hard. Even even when we have these little bubbles of goodness, and it's good to notice those, but it'd sure be nice to know, wouldn't it? And we see so many people who are suffering and so many people who are in need. Um, and we just cry out. We just take all of these things and we both carry them in ourselves and give them to you. And we know that we bear some responsibility, and also that you are there. So we take this time and we give it to you, and we cry out. We thank you for your presence. Amen. So I realize that it's already 20 after 11, and so at the end of like an hour-long sermon, it's going to be, well after lunchtime. But I'm sort of excited about my sermon this morning, so I'm going to talk anyway. And you guys can go eat lunch if you want to. That's fine. But, I'm just going to do my thing and you do your thing, and we'll all be fine. And you can watch it later on YouTube. That's all great with me, seriously. But I mean, the story that was read earlier, the story of Jesus walking on the water, is a preacher's dream, right? Sometimes we think that Jesus spoke in parables, and these are sort of metaphors, and then there's these stories about Jesus' life, and they're just stories about Jesus' life. But it's all metaphor, right? And the sermons that if you look at the story of Jesus walking on the water with a preacher's eye, it's all sermon. And so I thought I would just share that with you this morning, just all of the sermons in there, and how very, you'd think this would be like the most not relevant possible passage for a time like this. So who cares whether some guy 2,000 years ago walked on the water or not? But it's great. So let's look at this story, because so like Deb said, this happens just after the feeding of the 5,000, right? So this great and mighty miracle that Jesus does, and then, right, Jesus sends away his disciples, and he sends away all the people, and he goes up in the mountain to be with God. And again, so this is just such a metaphor for life, and such a good news for so many of us here, because we sort of see Jesus the introvert here, Jesus who needs to recharge his batteries by being alone, and by going to spend some time with God, and how important that was to Jesus. And if it's that important to Jesus, then it's not surprising that it's important to many of us here, just to take some time and, right, spend some time with God. And all them people, they're great, but let me just spend some time with God. So then he goes, so the disciples, of course, they don't see any of this. They're heading across the lake. Now, in my head, the way I see this story, the water is calm when Jesus walks across it. I don't know why that's true, but it seems to be. So like Philip, if you got that first picture, I found on one of the Preacher's Help sites, there were these pictures of Jesus walking on the water, and the first one looked like this, and that's the picture in my head. I don't know, I actually don't know anything about this picture. But this is sort of the picture in my head, is that Jesus is walking on the water and it's all nice and calm. And that's great. And it's easier to imagine, I think, because how do you walk across a rough lake? And now it's important not to imagine the waves being too big, right? For those of you who go to the seashore, you imagine these, 20-foot swells or something like that. Well, this is just sort of a decent sized lake. The Sea of Galilee is like 5 miles across, so you can get a good chop going on a lake like that, but not big, huge swells or anything like that. But you also have to realize that this is a fishing boat that they're on. It's not a transportation boat. It's going to be wide. It's going to be very stable, but it's not meant to actually go anywhere. And it's mostly full of non-sailors, right? So maybe some of the disciples were fishermen, but the rest weren't. And there's nothing more frustrating than having a whole bunch of crew who don't know what they're doing, right? So you don't have to imagine a lot of wind, especially if it's heading in the wrong direction, to be a significant impediment to a boat full of people who don't know what they're doing. But in any case, right, the actual picture we should have in our head is more like this second picture. So Philip, if you can put that one up, that would also be helpful. There we go, right? So something with a little bit of chop. Now, again, right, these pictures are always problematic, right? We have got a very, very white Jesus and a very, very white Peter, and the angels hovering around. There are angels hovering around, right? And this whole thing, right? So it's a hugely sort of white romance kind of piece. But at least there's some waves in this one. So all right. So anyway, this is of course a metaphor for life, right? That we go out there on the sea of life, and the wind is against us, and then Jesus comes to us, and Jesus says what? Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Right. So Jade already gave us that sermon this morning. Thank you very much, Jade. Right. And it just shows us like sort of how obvious the sermon is here, right? There it is. There's your sermon, right? How often during the day, during the week, are you going to need to hear that? Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid, right? This theme that runs itself through the Bible over and over again. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. And so we get this sermon and right? But that one's obvious again, right? These sermons are just so nice and easy. And then Peter does this cool thing. Peter wants to go out to do this whole walk on the water thing, but he's afraid. And you can see it in what he says. He says, "Jesus, command me to come to you." Like, I want to, but I only will if you're going to tell me I have to, right? It's this sort of desire and fear at the same time. Right. And again, like the metaphor here, right, of how many parts of our lives are also like this, these things we want to do, and yet they're what we really should be doing, but we're a little bit scared. And so, right, so sometimes it's helpful just to have a command somewhere. We read in the Bible, it says, "Thou shalt," and then you go, okay, well, now I have to, and I really want to anyway, right? So there's that. And Jesus responds with just this one word: come. So we have this call, and we could tell stories of the thousands and millions of people who've heard similar sorts of calls from Jesus. The call to come, that whatever it is, the call to do, the call to be, the call to be present, all of these things, this call to come echoes throughout the millennia now, and continues to be a part of faith. This call to come, to be the disciple, combined with do not be afraid. And at the same time, that there's really good reason to fear, right? Peter's about to step out of a perfectly good boat onto the lake. Right? If he's not afraid, it's because he's an idiot. And he's not an idiot, right? So there's a perfectly, right, really, really, really good reason to fear, and Jesus says, "Come anyway." Right? And then the sermons just keep coming, right? So Peter goes out on the water and he starts to sink when he looks at the wind rather than at Jesus. right? So again, I don't have to give you this sermon. It's just so obvious, right? Because that's right. So much of life right now, so much of COVID is right. Wow, we could look at all of the troubles in the world, right? And Jesus responds to him, right, by reaching out his hand and saying, why did you doubt? Right? Sermons just keep coming, right? And right, these days, it's really hard to notice anything except the wind, right? I mean, because it's not just one storm. It's not just one thing. It's not just COVID. It's not just COVID and the election. It's not just COVID and the election and the environmental crisis. It's right. It's just like it just keeps coming one after another. And so worship, right? What we're doing this morning is focusing on Jesus rather than the wind. I think that's what we're doing here. To take an hour, an hour and a half out of our week and focus on Jesus rather than on the wind. But it's not escape, right? If you want escape, that's what Netflix is for, right? That's what sports is for. Those things are meant to be escapes, and then you go back to your world, right? Back to reality. The focus of worship is to reorient your life. It's to say that this whole life that I'm living should be oriented toward the one who calls and the one who says, do not be afraid. And so what we're doing this morning is not escaping, we're practicing. And we've talked about this before, that the purpose of worship is to take some time and to practice. So some of the time we practice caring for one another, and some of the time we practice sharing with one another and bearing one another's burdens. And another thing we do during our worship time is to practice focusing on Jesus. To take this time and say, okay, right, I know about all of this other stuff that's happening, and I'm going to focus on Jesus, and I'm going to step out of this mostly perfectly good boat. I'm going to take a bit of a risk for Jesus. So that's our really, really obvious sermon this morning. And I'm sure, if you read the story over again sometime this week, you'd find even more sermons in this little story. But that's the one I wanted to share with you this morning. So now, in our breakout groups, I think you can have two options. The first is to, try to figure out ways to help one another focus on the wind, or focus on Jesus, right, rather than on the wind. Or you can go back to the question that I posed to Claire, which is the question of what have you learned? Right? What has this time taught you? So either one of those, pick something. I'm going to put you out.